The Prime Minister of Canada has invoked the rarely used emergency powers against the ongoing truckers' protest. It is only the second time in Canadian history that such powers have been invoked in peacetime. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act to address the blockades and the occupations. Trudeau ruled out using the military. He has made the emergency measures time-limited and geographically targeted, but the authorities would be granted more powers to arrest the protesters and seize their trucks in order to clear the blockades. Not just that, funding for these demonstrations will also be banned. Listen in.
After discussing with Cabinet and caucus, after consultation with premiers from all provinces and territories, after speaking with opposition leaders, the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear. The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address.
However, the use of the emergency measures needs to be approved by the Canadian Parliament within 7 days. In addition to providing the police resources, Ottawa will broaden the scope of its anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules to cover crowdfunding platforms. All crowdfunding programs and payment providers need to register with Canada's anti-money laundering agency. The government will also allow banks to temporarily freeze the accounts of those suspected of supporting the blockades without obtaining a court order. This act has been invoked with immediate effect at the border between Canada's Alberta and American state Montana. At least 11 protesters have been arrested with rifles, handguns, body armor and ammunition. Truckers and other protesters heard about the emergency powers but remained at the protest site. Hundreds of trucks are still clogging the streets of the Canadian capital. Over the past 2 weeks, hundreds of protesters in trucks have been rallying against the vaccine mandates. Ontario has been the epicenter of these demonstrations. The protesters have essentially been calling for the lifting of these health measures. The Premier of Ontario has now announced to lift the vaccine passport requirements in the Canadian province. The relaxation in the curbs follows higher vaccination figures and the peak of cases sparked by the Omicron variant. The easing of the Ontario health measures will start on the 17th of February. All capacity limits will be removed except for sporting events, concert venues and theatres. These will be capped at 50%, while some higher risk settings will also be capped at 25%. The vaccine passport itself will be removed by the 1st of March. With us on the broadcast is Candice Malcolm from Toronto. Malcolm is the editor-in-chief of the True North. Thanks very much, Candice, for being here with us. What is your reaction to the Prime Minister's decision to invoke these rarely used emergency powers to try and quell the protests, and what this means for the Freedom Convoy movement?
This is a complete overreaction by Canada's Prime Minister. It is completely unnecessary and completely disproportionate to what is going on the ground. We see peaceful protests all over Canada. We see Canadians standing up and saying that they've had enough of COVID restrictions and they want their civil liberties back. The overwhelming vast majority of these people are completely peaceful. Their moms and dads, their families, there's little kids. They're playing street hockey and playing music. They're having a good time. And Justin Trudeau lost control. He lost control. Both sides believe that he is to blame, both the people in favor of the convoy, the people who are against. So he reacted by basically pressing the nuclear button, by going nuclear, by pulling out every single stop that he can to try to enforce rules that, frankly, shouldn't even be there in the first place. The idea that we have a vaccine mandate at this point when COVID isn't doing the kind of damage that it was before. Canadians want to move on. Justin Trudeau doesn't get that. He's incredibly out of touch. And to use this unprecedented amount of power, it demonstrates that Justin Trudeau has lost control. He has no control. That is what the Emergency Act means. And so he's trying to regain control by acting like a dictator, by seizing people's bank accounts, suspending their insurance, and threatening to use military force against families who are waving Canadian flags and just want their freedoms back. It is a disgrace. This is a very sad moment for the country of Canada.
Right at the outset, when the protest started, Justin Trudeau went into hiding. What is your assessment of the manner in which he has handled these protests and the criticism that he has faced?
He completely made it worse. Look, he could have met with the protesters. He could have said, I disagree with you, but I'll meet with you. I respect you. I respect the right for peaceful protests in Canada. Instead, he didn't. He smeared the truckers. He claimed that they were Nazis. He claimed that they were far right, that they were terrorists. That's what this is all about. He's saying that these people, these Canadians, these working class Canadians who just simply want their liberties back, that they're extreme. And so he's treating them like an insurrection, like a foreign entity, insurrection, and like terrorists. And it's despicable to see. It's despicable, frankly, to see the media cheering him on and giving him a pass over this. And part of the reason why he invoked this is because he wants the police to do his dirty work. He wants them to go around like thugs and start arresting people and start invoking violence. The police said no. The police said people are mostly peaceful. And so that's why Trudeau is trying to use even more force, even more power to, again, treat political protesters, peaceful protesters, as if they're terrorists, seizing their bank accounts, saying that they're not allowed to raise money for their cause. Again, this is unprecedented. This should not be happening in Canada.
A series of polls, Candice, have been conducted on the vaccine measures, also on these protests. If you can take us through the key takeaways and also tell us more about the situation on the ground.
Sure. So what the Freedom Convoy hoped to obtain was to pressure political leaders, pressure public opinion to get rid of these harmful vaccine mandates and the restrictions on freedoms, including the forcing people to get vaccinated in order to go out to restaurants and to go out in public. The trucker convoy has been incredibly successful in that. If you look at public opinion, more than 50% of Canadians now support the truckers, including young Canadians, 18 to 34, a demographic that was usually in support of Justin Trudeau and left-wing politics. 61% of those people in that age group say that they support the truckers. 2/3 of Canadians now say that they want the mandates lifted. So as far as public opinion, the truckers are winning. We've seen the restrictions removed in places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Prince Edward Island. The provinces don't want these measures, these emergency measures. It used to be called the War Measures Act. Now it's called the Emergency Measures Act. Quebec, the main province where Prime Minister Trudeau is from, has said that this isn't necessary and they don't want it in their province. So look, the country is split. I won't deny that. Some people want the measures in place. Some people are still very afraid of COVID. And other people, like these working class truckers, say it's time to move on. It's time to get back to living our life. Trudeau stubbornly refuses to meet with them. There was a Conservative motion in Parliament yesterday that said, let's come up with a plan to remove restrictions and get back to normal. Trudeau said no. His Liberal members of caucus voted against that. So they're unwilling to compromise. They're unwilling to meet with the truckers. They're unwilling to even discuss the idea of getting back to normal in Canada. As the rest of the world is lifting restrictions and getting back to normal, Canada is increasingly outlier. And again, seeing Justin Trudeau invoke these emergency measures as if the country is at war, as if there's some kind of a terrorist insurrection, that's just not the case. That's not happening in Canada. These are peaceful protests. These are happy people. This is a patriotic pro-Canada protest. And the fact that Trudeau is treating these people like this and that the media is allowing him to do that and saying it's fine and saying it's okay to step on civil liberties and suspend civil liberties, it's terrifying to see. And I think that most Canadians disagree and don't want to see Canada go down this path.
Right. The use of the emergency measures needs to be approved by the Canadian Parliament within 7 days. If that happens, where do you see things heading from here onwards?
Well, Trudeau said that he wants to compel tow truck drivers to move these trucks. Part of Trudeau's problem is that the enforcement mechanisms of his government are failing because people don't agree with him. So he wants the police to go in and arrest people. The police don't want to do that. He wants tow trucks to go in there and tow these truckers. But the tow trucks said no. The tow trucks are with the truckers. They don't want to tow the trucks. They want their freedoms back. And so Trudeau is now having to use military force to compel people to do things. This is Justin Trudeau showing desperation. And yes, it needs to be approved by Parliament. That is something that was added so that when it changed from the initial War Measures Act to now the Emergency Act, one of the checks and balances is that it must be approved in Parliament. Unfortunately, Canada has a very weak Parliament right now. Justin Trudeau is the smallest minority government in Canada's history, but is propped up by a socialist party that is totally hapless. Even though they disagree with Trudeau, even though they think Trudeau's done a bad job managing these protests, they still are in favor of this measure. The old socialists of Canada would have never approved for the use of martial law in the country, for the use of unprecedented government powers. But the current NDP Socialist Party is so confused and so unsure of what to do that they're giving Trudeau more power, and again, it's not a good position to be in Canada. We don't have the proper checks and balances. We don't have the rule of law in its proper sense, and I worry about the way that Justin Trudeau is acting, the way that he's amassing power, and the lack of accountability around him and the Prime Minister's office right now.
Candice Mackem, thanks very much for being here with us on WION World is One and sharing those perspectives. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.